This morning began for me with a phone call precisely at 8 a.m. I live in a small, cozy house on the outskirts of Seattle, where each day starts with the familiar sound of rain pattering against the window and the muted light filtering through the gray clouds. This place has become my quiet refuge after years spent in the noisy heart of the city, where every morning meant rush, traffic jams, and chaos. Here, away from all the commotion, my life has finally found the tranquility and rhythm I had always dreamed of. As I picked up the phone, the screen displayed the name Laura, my friend from college, someone who had always held a special place in my heart, even though our paths had diverged. Hearing her voice was like being transported back to those simpler times. "Annie, hi," I heard Laura's excited voice. "I have a problem. Vanessa, your goddaughter, has been sent on a business trip across the country. And Thomas, he's sick. I need to leave for work for 3 days. Could you watch him?" I paused for a moment. Thomas had always been like a younger brother to me, though we had rarely seen each other lately. The last time we met was a year ago at Laura's graduation, and I was surprised at how much he had grown, not just into a quiet, somewhat withdrawn teenager, but into a noticeably mature young man. At 18, tall and handsome, and unexpectedly for me, quite attractive. There was something deep, almost adult in his gaze, tinged with a hint of sadness. "Of course. Come over," I replied. The next day, Laura brought Thomas to my house. Tall and awkward, he stood on my doorstep, his eyes hidden behind strands of dark hair. A slight thrill shot through me. Had he really grown up and become this appealing? Our greetings were reserved, almost shy, but I quickly invited him to make himself comfortable and feel at home. The first hours passed in awkward silence. Thomas sat on the couch, absorbed in his phone, while I tried not to disturb him, busying myself with chores. But my thoughts kept drifting back to him. I was trying to figure out how to reconnect with this seemingly distant person who, suddenly, felt so different from the familiar Thomas I once knew. As I moved around the room, I caught glimpses of him stealing glances at me, his curiosity palpable. I could feel a tension building in the air, an unspoken connection lingering between us. It was both exhilarating and confusing, igniting something within me that I hadn't expected. In the evening, I suggested to Thomas that we take a walk through the neighborhood, and to my surprise, he agreed. We strolled down a quiet street, passing homes with well-kept lawns and trees, adorned with yellow leaves. Suddenly, he began to speak, at first slowly and reluctantly, but his words were sincere. Thomas shared his worries, school, a strange feeling of loneliness among his peers, and thoughts about the future. I listened intently, not interrupting, feeling something warm stirring within me, almost maternal, yet more personal. On the third day, Thomas came into the kitchen while I was making breakfast. He looked almost cheerful, as if our quiet conversations and evening strolls had become a refuge for him. I caught myself thinking how sad I would feel when he left. That morning, as the rain tapped gently on the roof again, Thomas looked at me with a special expression, grateful and a little shy. "You know, I never thought I could feel so good with someone," he said. Turning away to hide his embarrassment, I smiled, feeling something in my heart resonate with his words. In that simple, trusting moment, we both understood that something significant was budding between us. It wasn't romance, but a deep, quiet understanding of each other. I hesitated slightly, feeling a warm affection growing within me for this shy yet remarkably sincere young man. I remembered how lost I had felt at his age, surrounded by people yet still lonely. I wanted to say something encouraging, but the right words eluded me. Finally, I just took his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. Our fingers lingered together, the touch electric, a connection beyond words. I could sense the shift in the air, a palpable tension that held us close, as if the rain outside had brought us into our own little world. The softness of his hand in mine stirred a desire I hadn't anticipated, a longing that made my heart race. As we stood there, the distance between us faded, replaced by an unspoken promise that this moment was only the beginning. Thank you, Thomas. I didn't expect us to get along so well either. The next morning, I chose a slightly bolder, lighter outfit, different from what I usually wore, just to see how he would react when he walked into the kitchen to help me. I could tell he was trying to be discreet, but his eyes were intently following me, taking in every detail. It was clear he was noticing, even as he attempted to maintain his composure. Seizing the moment, I casually asked while setting plates on the table, "Do you think I'm overdoing it with this outfit?" "Sorry, but I love to feel comfortable at home." He smiled awkwardly, and after a brief pause replied, "No, you look great. You can relax." After breakfast, we set out for another walk, and Thomas showed me the places he usually spent time, a modest bookstore on the corner, a cozy cafe where we ordered hot cocoa. Over our warm drinks, Thomas began to share his dreams. He was contemplating his studies, wanting to become a scientist, and hoped to change the world, although he wasn't quite sure where to start. I listened to his thoughts, feeling a swell of pride for his aspirations and honesty. At the same time, a hint of sadness washed over me. In front of me was not a child, but a young man who needed so little for happiness, just attention and understanding. As we spoke, I caught him glancing at me more often, the intensity in his gaze making my heart race. The way he focused on me, as if he were trying to memorize every feature, sent a warm thrill through me. I wondered if he could sense the shift in our connection, the growing intimacy that lingered in the air between us. By midday, the sky cleared, and we returned home. I suggested to Thomas that we watch some old films, my favorites that he hadn't seen yet. We settled onto the couch, and as the movie played, the space between us seemed to disappear without us even noticing. I could feel Thomas becoming more comfortable next to me, and I marveled at how good I felt myself. When the movie ended, Thomas asked a question that made me pause. "Anna, have you ever wanted to leave this place? To live differently?" I smiled, recalling my dreams of distant lands and new beginnings that once seemed so significant. In the end, I chose this place and its peaceful rhythm of life. Looking at Thomas, I realized he was looking at me not just as a mentor, but as a true friend. "Sometimes," I answered honestly. "But you know, life is wonderful, in that it always gives you what you need, even if it's not always what you want. The key is to remain open and be honest with yourself." Thomas seemed satisfied with my answer, and the rest of the day passed in warm, quiet silence. We no longer discussed serious topics, but just the presence of each other filled the house with coziness. As we sat together, I felt a subtle tension in the air, a soft, electric current that hinted at something deeper blossoming between us. Each glance, each shared laugh, seemed to draw us closer, wrapping us in a tender intimacy that felt both thrilling and frightening. I decided to prepare dinner, and as I was chopping vegetables, I suddenly felt someone's presence behind me. Turning around, I saw Thomas standing so close that I could feel his energy brushing against me. When he leaned a little closer, my heart raced, and a smile spread across his face. "Anna, do you need help with that?" he whispered. For a moment, I was at a loss for words. I tried to keep my composure, although my voice trembled slightly as I replied. He simply smiled that sweet smile of his. When it came time to go to bed, I suddenly realized how difficult it would be to say goodbye. The next day, when Laura arrived to pick up Thomas, I felt a slight ache in my chest. He smiled at me and thanked me, his gaze shyly diverted, as if he didn't know how to express his feelings. I too struggled to find the words to explain the warm feelings I had for someone who had become so close to me. At the door, he turned back and quietly said, "You will always be special to me, Anna." I watched him leave, knowing that something deeply personal would remain between us, an invisible connection, as delicate as a spider's web, yet strong and sincere. Returning to the house, I felt a strange emptiness, but also a warm joy. A week passed since Thomas left, and I gradually returned to my usual life. I missed his presence, our heartfelt conversations, and those fleeting moments when he opened up to me, making me feel young and needed again. But all of that remained quiet memories, until one evening, my phone rang again. It was Laura. "Annie, you won't believe it. Thomas left after school today and hasn't come back. I've called all his friends, but no one knows where he is. I'm in despair." Laura's voice trembled with panic, and a sense of dread grew within me. I quickly threw on my coat and rushed out of the house, taking Laura's car. I didn't have a clear plan, but I knew I couldn't stand by. Memories of what Thomas had told me about his favorite places, cafes and the bookstore, flashed through my mind. Maybe he was there. I drove around to each place, but there was no sign of him. Then, a thought struck me about the abandoned park outside of town, the one he once mentioned enjoying for its solitude. I headed there quickly, my anxiety mounting with every passing moment. Thoughts of how I could have protected him tormented me. Seconds stretched on endlessly, until finally, I spotted a familiar silhouette at the edge of the park, where the trees grew denser and darker. Thomas sat on a concrete bench, hugging his knees, staring into the void. His face was pale, and I could see something grim lurking in his eyes. "Thomas!" I shouted, rushing towards him. When he turned, his face lit up with that familiar warmth, mixed with surprise and relief. "Anna, how did you find me?" he asked quietly, though there was a desperate weariness in his voice. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm sorry. I just needed to think. Everything has become so complicated lately, and I didn't know who to talk to about it." I sat down beside him, feeling my heart racing in my chest. It hurt to see him so lost, but I understood that the most important thing was simply to be there for him. "You can always talk to me, Thomas," I said softly, gently touching his shoulder. "Whatever happens, I'm always here to listen and help." Thomas sighed, turning to face me. Tears shimmered in his eyes, and it seemed that for the first time, he allowed himself to show me his vulnerability. "I feel like I can't find my place in this world, Anna," he said, his voice trembling. "All these expectations, plans. I feel like I'll never be what my parents, teachers, even my friends want me to be. I just don't know who I am." My heart ached for him. I didn't know what to say to help, but I knew I had to be strong so he could feel my support. I wrapped my arms around him, letting him feel my presence, my genuine warmth. "You are already who you are meant to be, Thomas," I whispered, holding him tightly. All you need is to trust yourself and be honest with who you are. And if you feel like the world doesn't understand you, I'm here. I'm always on your side. You are so much more than you can imagine. Thomas slowly relaxed in my embrace. In our silence, there were no words, but at that moment, we both knew we had found something special and valuable, a strong connection that felt like a lifeline in this turbulent world. I no longer feared for him, and he knew that no matter who he became, he would always find me by his side, ready to understand and accept him. I understood that Thomas needed not only someone to listen to him, but also a safe space where he could feel needed and secure. With a soft smile, I suggested, "Why don't we go to my place? I think you need a little rest, and I have hot chocolate and blankets." Thomas didn't resist. He simply nodded, his shoulders relaxing slightly, and a hint of relief flickered in his eyes. We got into the car, and the drive to my home took only a few minutes. But during that time, he began to calm down. He quietly gazed out the window, and the muted silence between us felt healing in itself. As soon as we entered the house, I turned on the dim lights, draped cozy blankets over the couch, and set milk on the stove to heat for the hot chocolate. Thomas sat by the fireplace, wrapping his arms around himself, and the whole house was enveloped in a unique atmosphere, rare and precious for both of us. "I didn't expect you to come looking for me," he said quietly as I settled beside him with our cups of hot chocolate. I thought I was no one's concern. My heart ached at those words. I understood that this smart and sensitive boy carried deep pain within him, one that even his parents hadn't tried to penetrate. I set my cup on the table and looked into his eyes. "Thomas, you matter to many, including me," I replied, gently touching his hand. "Sometimes we just need a little more time to figure out how to express that. I'm proud of you for being honest." We continued to talk, and I caught myself thinking that I understood him in a way no one else did. At one point, he asked me about my own journey in youth, and I shared my doubts and search for self. I told him how I fought for my place in this world, how I doubted myself. But over time, I learned to find joy in the little things and not fear seeking my own meanings. Thomas listened to me with deep attention, as if every piece of advice I offered was a guiding star. I noticed his face brightening, and a sense of determination emerged in his gaze, something I had longed to see in him. "You know, I never thought anyone could understand me," he finally confessed, looking at me with tenderness and gratitude. "With you, I feel at home." Thomas's words warmed me, and I sighed lightly, smiling back at him. I felt this night had become something greater for us than just a conversation. It was an acceptance that now bound us on a profound level. When it became late for Thomas to return home, I offered him to stay, and we spent the night together. As we settled onto the couch, the warmth of the blankets enveloped us. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, and an electric tension hung in the air between us. Our hearts beat in sync, creating an intimate rhythm that pulled us closer. I gazed at him, my heart racing, and he returned my gaze with a mixture of uncertainty and longing. "Are you sure?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, leaning in a little closer, feeling the warmth of his breath against my skin. "I want you here, Thomas," I said, my voice steady, but laced with vulnerability. "You don't have to be alone." He hesitated for just a moment before closing the gap between us. Our lips met softly at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened as we lost ourselves in the kiss. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of us, wrapped in warmth and desire, as the fire crackled gently nearby.